All right, let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nora Wang Asram, the Senior Director of Research at ACEEE. For those new to our webinar, ACEEE is a nonprofit research organization based in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to develop policies that reduce energy waste and combat climate change. Today, our focus is on exploring how information and communications technologies, or ICT, and grid edge technologies can play a crucial role in accelerating and ensuring the reliable electrification and decarbonization of buildings, transportation, and industrial sectors. Before we introduce the speakers, I would like to, mention one article I read yesterday. Utility Dive featured a brief with the headline U.S. electricity load growth forecast jumps 81%. A recent analysis utilizing data from FERC indicates that grid planners anticipate a 4.7 increase in nationwide power demand over the next 5 years, surpassing the early estimate of 2.6%. The analysis underscores that a significant driver for this load growth is a substantial $630 billion investment in facilities with substantial loads, such as industrial facilities, manufacturing, as well as data center. This financial boost is attributed to CHIPS and Science Act, along with Inflation Reduction Act. Very exciting. However, a formidable challenge lies ahead. The U.S. grid is currently unprepared for this surge in new demand. In today's discussion with our panelists, we aim to explore this challenge and delve into the potential solutions. On the screen, you can see today our speakers are Hayden Reeves, Senior Technical Advisor from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Andrew Hoffmeyer, Industrial Program Research Analyst from ACEEE, Dave Holm, General Manager of Energy from Dell Technologies. Unfortunately, Dave has a last-minute conflict. He cannot join. Fran Stum, Energy Transition Lead from Dell Technologies, is replacing Dave as our speaker today. I'll let her introduce herself when she presents. John O'Donnell, CEO of Rondo Energy, and Erica Gupta, Head of Sustainability, Siemens Financial Services America. You can find our bios from our website, and Archie, maybe you can share a link in the chat so people can take a look at it too. So each speaker will have 5 to 10 minutes to share their insights, which will be followed by a panel discussion. For any questions you have, please utilize the Q&A box. The webinar will be recorded and made available on our website, and presentation slides will be provided to all attendees today. All right, so before I turn to our first speaker, we have 2 polling questions to help us learn about you and your interest. Nick, please start poll number 1. All right, terrific, thank you. So the first question is for us to understand your roles and job functions relevant to the topic that we have today. We'll give maybe 30 seconds for you to check the box. All right, I hope that's a straightforward to answer, Nick. If you can share the results. Okay, so that's great. Assuming everybody can see the results, but I'm gonna go through it quickly. We have 20% of policymakers, 24% of energy service providers. The second tier includes researchers and policy advocates like us. And then we also have utilities and grid customers. Unfortunately, we do not have grid regulator today. And there's some categories in others. All right, thank you. This is very helpful. Nick, please start poll number 2. All right, so the second question is about deployment barriers. Our panelists will share their view, but we want to hear from you first. What do you think will be the biggest barriers? You can check all that apply. This may take some thinking time. Maybe Nick, I'll let you decide since you can see how many people have responded so far. When you see the majority have voted, and you can share the results with us. All right, looks like the answers are pretty much evenly distributed, and then the highest one is the lack of understanding the value of ICT and grid edge technology. That's fantastic. That's really the topic of today to help gain more insights. And then the second is the utility and RTO incentive structures, and followed by grid regulation. Sorry, I misread it. The second include supply chain and workforce. The third is grid regulation, followed by other grid projects, the competing priorities. With some other answers, we would like to know what it is if you'd like to share it in the chat box. All right, so without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Hayden, to kick off our discussion today, and Hayden will give an overview of grid edge technologies. Please take away, Hayden.
Excellent, thank you, Nora. So today I want to focus my remarks really on work we've been doing at PNNL, understanding sort of the role and value of grid edge technologies in the context of different grid edge services that could be provided. So if you go to the next slide, I want to just spend a little bit of time sort of setting the table in terms of some of the key trends and motivations. Most of these I think will be very familiar with you, but I think it's worth mentioning. So first has been this technology revolution. Part of this is electrification at the grid edge, electric vehicles and heat pumps, distributed generation in terms of rooftop solar, but also the enabling technologies to allow the participation in terms of controls and communication. At the same time, we're seeing more inciting incidents on the grid. These are essentially extreme weather events that are driving loads beyond sort of traditional norms, whether it be the heat dome we had in the Pacific Northwest or Winter Storm Uri in Texas. And then with renewables getting added to the bulk system, we're seeing more wholesale price volatility as well. And this and other factors have sort of spurred regulatory movement. I think the best and biggest example is FERC Order 2222, but California, in the wake of their blackouts in 2020, have implemented a flex market, working towards the MIDAS system for dynamic prices. Meanwhile, other responses have included Texas outlawing the wholesale indexing of retail rates coming out of Winter Storm Uri. So there's been a lot of activity. So if you go to the next slide, one of the challenges we see, though, is that there are many different names and many different offerings in different regions for what are essentially the same grid services. And so colleagues at the national labs have worked to sort of summarize this. So on the left of this chart, you'll see the different names of typical offerings and services on the distribution system side. On the right are key sort of grid functions that we need on the distribution and the bulk system. And we've worked to sort of summarize these to 6 core grid services. And I'll use this framework to talk a little bit more as I go through. But these involve very quick services like frequency response and regulation, longer term services like energy services and capacity or reserve, as well as like voltage and black start services. So if we go to the next slide, PNNL has been doing a lot of work, both demonstrating in the field and with partners the ability to provide these grid services from end users in the field, But we've also been doing a lot of work studying and analyzing future systems. And so one big study that we completed last year was basically modeling the entire ERCOT system to show what large-scale demand-side participation means and how you might do that. And so we had a large integrated system model. We looked at different sort of coordination frameworks. But the thing I want to really emphasize and showcase today is looking at the valuation methodology. How do we track the economics of these systems? How they might be distributed amongst participants based on different incentives. And this was important to us that the sort of the economic lens had as much resolution as we typically apply to like the physical system engineering understanding as well. So if you go to the next slide, I'll spend a little bit of talk through this example, and I'll put a link to the study in the chat with much more details about background. But this is an example of sort of a generic flow of cash through a grid system coming out of our study. And so on the left, you'll see typical customers, residential, commercial, and industrial customers, who every month get a bill. On that bill, you have your volumetric energy charges, you have your fixed connection charges, and if you're a commercial or industrial customer, you have your demand charges. And this is how the utility, or in this case, we call him a distribution system operator, collects the revenue they need to meet their expenses. And then their expenses in the middle are energy purchases from the wholesale energy market. If you're in a part of the country with a capacity market, your capacity payments, ancillary services payments, transmission access fees, and then you just have the cost of running your distribution system as well in the middle. And then as we move to the right, that translates through different wholesale generators to our terminal expenses. And then what was illustrative to us is that even today, before we continue towards a more renewable future with zero marginal fuel costs today are only about 15% of running the grid. Wholesale energy purchases are maybe in the range of 25, 30%. There's just a lot of cost today in terms of fixed capital and operating costs. So if you advance one more, I think this is useful to understand the proportionality of different functions of operating the grid and different grid services. So in terms of the grid services I was talking about, like energy services is maybe about 30% of running the grid. Reserve or capacity, which you could combine with energy services, is more. The frequency response regulation ancillary services is only a small fraction, and a lot of the grid cost is just essentially what I call shipping and handling. So if we go to the last slide, just some concluding remarks here. As we've found, and as many people know, there are just large fixed costs to operating the grid. And I think we'll see these grow, and we'll continue to see higher volatility in wholesale energy prices, and a desire to pass those on in terms of dynamic retail prices or time of use prices. The second thing is there are now many, many proof points, both in studies and in real life, of the very large value proposition of grid edge participation. But the realization of that value proposition and the access to that varies considerably regionally. All right, so some regions have become very motivated to enable this, others not so much. And then finally, I think we'll see differences among these grid services in terms of which ones might be monetized and accessible to grid edge participants, things like energy capacity reserve services. But some just may not be big enough in size in terms of frequency regulation, and some that just might be too complex and too hard to try and incentivize it for grid edge participants as we go forward. So with that, I will pass it over to the next speaker.
All right, thanks, Hayden. It's wonderful opening of today's discussion, and you mentioned evaluation methodology and economic performance. That's a good segue into Andrew's presentation. The next presenter is Andrew, and he's going to present our ACEE's work on quantifying the carbon reduction potential of some of the ICT technology on the downstream customers. Please go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Nora, and thanks so much, everyone, for coming. As Nora mentioned, I'm Andrew Hoffmeister, a researcher on the industry team at ACEEE, and I've been working on the opportunities presented by intelligent efficiency and smart manufacturing for several years now, and in multiple research capacities. And we think that the solutions empowered by technology, by automation, information sharing, and the associated infrastructure will increasingly become part of the decarbonization effort, especially with the impetus of increasing electrification, need for efficiency, and to manage growing electricity loads, and the momentum behind IRA, CHIPS and Science, other legislation. But my big talking point here is that we already know that ICT can be very effective in reducing emissions throughout supply chains and across multiple sectors of the economy. But in evaluating and calculating energy savings and emission reducing potential, we found that actually quantifying emissions reductions that ICT enable in those complex value chains and attributing them to be very difficult, especially downstream of deployment. There are a lot of actors obviously involved in value chains of developing and implementing ICT solutions, and there's no agreed upon methodology for attributing credit to them. Next slide, please, Archie. So that's where a methodology called carbon handprint comes in, which we've been researching and applying to various case studies. And carbon handprint is an emerging accounting method to overcome that complex supply chain barrier. And basically, and there's really no need to go beyond this level of complexity, a carbon handprint refers to the difference in emissions between a baseline process and the same process with an ICT application that affects emissions. So that approach, when paired with a carbon footprint estimation, we're not replacing carbon footprint. So I think we all know what carbon footprint is. That provides a more comprehensive sort of understanding of companies' emissions, contributions in the supply chain, including critically reductions. So we still need the carbon footprint to understand the emissions directly caused by a technology or by a strategy. But the handprint can reveal impacts enabled by the incorporated technologies or strategies in the use phase, which may be critical for calculating things like Scope 3 emissions. So in these two graphics that I have here, there's a handprint calculation methodology, which we look to sort of standardize what the steps are in terms of finding a handprint, defining the scope, identifying the contributors, identifying a baseline for comparison, obviously, defining a functional unit, and finally calculating the footprint baseline, the footprint of a solution, and the handprint, which is the difference between them. So the goal in the effort of decarbonization is to minimize one's own carbon footprint while maximizing a beneficial carbon handprint. Next slide, please, Archie. So ACEEE has been working for several years now with key technology partners like Cisco, Dell, and Intel to build out a proof of concept of what exactly handprint is and to evaluate the potential in calculating downstream emissions reduction impacts of ICT. Specifically, we've looked at these three case studies that I have here: the optimization of utility substations through a grid management solution, the optimization of depot charging of electric vehicles used for short-haul freight, drayage, and fleets, and smart thermostats. So obviously, I can't spend too much time on the details here, but I'll cover very broadly the applications of each of our case studies and what the handprint analysis uniquely captures in this context. So we built out replicable calculators for finding the handprints, and we included optimizable inputs for various specifications. Firstly, I have smart thermostats here, which save energy broadly by using machine learning and data storage to adjust temperature settings based on patterns and preferences. And we compared the emissions of a home or homes using smart thermostats to the life cycle emissions of a home using traditional thermostats across multiple scenarios of adoption. And the handprint that we ended up analyzing was the difference in emissions between the solution and traditional thermostats, which is otherwise lost if only evaluating the carbon footprint of the smart thermostat. So what we found was in 6 million Texas homes, which we analyzed specifically, they saved between 0.52 and 1.35 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, patterned out to 2028. For the grid management solution, a Dell product that Fran will cover in the next presentation as well, we focus specifically on the voltage optimization that the technology we modeled enables, which saves energy by reducing the losses, improving the ability of substations to match grid supply to specific load needs. And we looked at finding the handprint of 5 New York substations when comparing annual optimized load to a projected business as usual load. And we used Cambium grid scenarios to account for uncertainty and modeled it forward. And the handprint there is so critical to capture in order to understand the full impact of the technology and its actual use phase. So critical for both utilities and technology companies to be able to find the actual emissions impact of the grid management solutions they deploy or are implementing. And we found a handprint impact of 1,500 to 8,500 metric tons of carbon dioxide per New York substation per year using this method. That's the handprint impact. And the final case study was in electric vehicle fleet charging, where we compared a solution that charges groups of vehicles optimally based on hourly cost and marginal emissions. And the technology works to optimize the intensity and timing of electric fleet charging through both ICT-enabled charging schedules, control, and grid integration for power delivery during peak period. So critically, what we managed to do is build out these 3 calculation approaches for ICT that are either ready for implementation or close to it and approaching a pilot phase of study. And handprint enables us to more holistically understand the total emissions impact of these technologies in the supply chain. And again, these efforts were just to demonstrate a proof of concept in very specific applications, which can be modified, but the result of which in this case is obviously very specific. Next slide, please, Archie. So now that we've determined or demonstrated that handprint can be estimated in specific applications, we think that companies can now use similar approaches to begin to evaluate and report the full impacts of their products. The next step is to continue applying the handprint calculation methodology and tailoring it to more specific use cases, other specific use cases. And what we determined is that there needs to be a standardized pathway towards attribution of emissions impacts in complex supply chains, especially in order to motivate companies to continue producing emission-saving technologies. And handprint is just one of those methodologies that we wanted to demonstrate that we believe in. Handprint gets us on our way as a streamlined, uniform in its steps that I showed earlier, approach to revealing the impacts of a technology solution compared to its alternative, the business as usual. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening. I think the applications of the handprint methodology will grow as technologies scale and complexity increases. I think this is a critical topic area to make sure that we can engage with scope 3 and supply chain emissions and emission saving in a holistic way. And I have my email there in case you want to reach out to me with any individual thoughts, questions, or connections. And I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
All right, thank you, Andrew. The next speaker, as mentioned, is Fran, now Dave from Dell Technology. And Fran, I'll let you introduce yourself and thank you for stepping in. We have heard, discussion from the national lab, the NGO in this space. Now we're turning into industry. You guys are producing these technologies and putting into practice. Maybe you can share your perspective with us. Please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nora. And thank you, Andrew, for setting the scene for my presentation. Yeah, so I'm filling in for David today. I represent our Dell Technologies energy team, and my role in the team is energy transition lead. So the Dell Technologies, I guess you can go ahead, next slide, please, Archie. Thank you. The Dell Technologies energy team is working within the energy industry to deliver a comprehensive and sustainable portfolio of solutions that are focused on accelerating the clean energy transition, advancing decarbonization, and ensuring energy security. And one of those solutions is what Andrew alluded to in his presentation, our grid modernization and substation virtualization solutions. So Hayden did a great job setting the scene of the industry, if you will, so I won't go too deep into the context, but as the industry executes a digital energy transformation unlike anything we've seen before, Dell Technologies is supporting the convergence of IT and OT systems, the deployment of real-time autonomous edge systems, and a holistic approach to modern cyber resilience. We understand that the energy transition will take place over decades and will continue to provide solutions that enable the safe and effective exploitation of traditional resources while minimizing the environmental impact. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about our VPAC solution, our virtualized protection, automation, and control, also known as our virtualized substation solution. Distributed forms of energy generation wind, solar, geothermal all have very different location considerations to traditional forms of generation. More importantly, their power output is not as flat as traditional forms of generation. This makes forecasting and managing the necessary balance of generation and demand a much more complex task. Things are also changing on the demand side. As Andrew said, our global consumption of electricity continues to rise, with new forms of consumption such as electric vehicles fueling this demand. Patterns of consumption are further complicated due to the local generation from rooftop solar and systems that change traditional models of consumption and generation, such as microgrids. These developments are key to the transition towards a more sustainable energy future, but they also result in a much more complex power grid for which traditional models of control are not adequate at this point in time. And grid operators are largely left without the tools that they need to simultaneously navigate this transition and maintain that balance. Grid-scale energy storage helps smooth out the balance of shifting demand with the generation, a sort of load disaggregation, if you will. And additionally, leveraging more complex grid automation will be key to controlling and balancing the increasing number of dynamic producers, as well as dynamic consumers of power, while maintaining the grid resiliency and security that we need. Next slide, please. So as Andrew introduced, we worked with ACEEE on completing one of these carbon handprint assessments specifically for our grid modernization solution. Most organizations are engaged in minimizing the negative environmental impacts, their carbon footprint, which we're most familiar with, of their activities through the efficient use of resources and lowered emissions. But to quote the U.S. National Climate Advisor, Ali Saidi, we need the receipts when referring to how we measure and manage emissions data. So the way that we're doing this now, in this methodology that we discussed earlier, is the handprint assessment. So working with our partners, Intel and VMware, Dell Technologies is taking the next step to reduce the carbon footprint of their customers by developing products and services that create positive effects, a handprint, if you will. So we're currently working towards measuring our exact carbon handprint in collaboration with ACEEE. And as our mutual end customers increasingly focus on sustainability, our ability to collaborate with other vendors and our partners to understand and optimize and attribute these carbon handprints and footprints to our solutions uniquely differentiates us from our competitors. Next slide. So Andrew introduced this, but the specific use case that Dell Technologies covered in our carbon handprint assessment was the optimization of the substation through virtualization and load disaggregation, or voltage optimization, as Andrew said. This is just kind of a framework of what the case study looked like, a comparison of high use case, mid case, and low use case scenarios, and the resulting savings and efficiency and emissions. And we can gloss over this and answer any questions you have in the Q&A section, but I think there's one more slide. Yeah, and these were the results of that assessment. The data that we took was from those 5 substations in New York, because that's what was publicly available. And as you can see, if we use the mid-case example as our baseline result, these annual savings for equivalent carbon or equivalent CO2 are up there in the megatons. So it's pretty notable, and being able to attribute the footprint or handprint savings to this part of the supply chain is really important when we're talking about the benefits of ICT enabled solutions like grid modernization. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions after the presentations, but thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you, Fran. As Andrew and Fran both mentioned, we have very detailed analysis and data to be shared. Once you get the slides, you have the link to that. We'll also have time to ask some questions. So next, I would like to invite John from Roundel Energy. John will talk about how thermal storage can be a key enabler for industrial decarbonization and the barriers that technology pioneers like Roundel are facing. Please go ahead, John.
Thank you, Nora. And it's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, I want to talk about something that people have thought is adjacent to the grid, but it is the next big challenge for the grid. The total world final energy use, industry is the largest single portion of it, and 3/4 of the energy used by industry, 3/4 of all the coal, oil, and natural gas burned in the world is for industrial heat. It's 6 gigatons plus, and it's hundreds of millions of tons in the United States. In the United States, fuel is burned. This is an assessment by Energy Innovation. It's like, where does industry burn fuel? And it's, people think of industry as cement and steel. Well, it is, but it's also food and paper and chemicals and fuels. And, is this hard to decarbonize? The challenge is that we are producing all kinds of low-cost commodities where energy is a really important part of the cost of production. It's going to go as slow as possible if a new solution is more expensive than fuel. There are other technical requirements about energy has to be continuous and has to be high temperature. And as you know, the theory has been that the grid is going to have to hugely expand to deliver the 99.99% reliability that these boilers and furnaces deliver today, that industrial electrification is going to be new continuous load on the grid. That's not really well matched with the asset that we have, though, right? The new assets are intermittent, and we are intermittently now having electricity all kinds of places in the US grid driven by the drive in renewables that is lower cost than fuel. So if there were a means of storing that energy to deliver industrial heat continuously, harvesting intermittent power, we could be making big strides. Of course, one of the things that people have said for a long time is we're going to use hydrogen electrolyzers that we operate some of the time to have heat all of the time. Their costs and especially their efficiency means that without large taxpayer subsidies, they're a long way away. And none of the models show these operating less than 70% capacity factor. Electrochemical batteries also are in all kinds of development, and they're still at least a decade away from reaching price points that they could replace fuel, a fraction of the cost of electricity. But there are now dozens of companies working on not doing electrochemistry, but just heating something, a liquid or a solid, as a means of storing energy to decarbonize so that you could get continuous heat from intermittent power from the grid or for that matter, for local generation. Rondo happens to be harvesting we stand on shoulders that started 200 years ago in the steel industry. There's a particular brick material that is used for heat storage at or above 1500 C. There's, well over 500,000 tons of this material in use today. We found a way to build electrically heated energy storage devices that store energy as heat in that very same brick, and then deliver heat continuously to an industrial process by using a completely conventional heat recovery boiler or delivering heat directly to an industrial process into a kiln or a furnace. These heat batteries serve 95% of the temperature range of all US manufacturing. If you do a units conversion for how much energy is this? If we're going to build new generation wind or solar, it's more than 1,200 gigawatts of generation that will ultimately be needed to repower US industry. And, that is now a fundamentally new kind of load in the grid. These are things that are not taking power continuously, but are price responsive, are telemetry connected, can be dispatched just the way that generation can be dispatched, and can provide resilience and reliability services to the grid, so that there are, again, intermittent power to continuous heat in the form of steam or hot air. As it happens, the Rondo Tech, all of the electric thermal storage technologies are at or above about 90% efficient. From electricity heat, we happen to be 98% efficient, the highest efficiency of any kind of energy storage of any kind. And These systems also have the prospect of playing a unique role in delivering distributed generation at factory locations using the same cogeneration technologies that Purpose supported back in the 1980s, but instead of being powered by fossil heat, they're powered by intermittently captured electricity and are on a combined basis delivering a continuous electricity and heat at over 95% combined efficiency. We're just at the beginning. Rondo is now operating at a little corn ethanol refinery in Pixley, California. The refinery is not little, I misspoke. We're operating a small 2 megawatt hour unit today that it happens to be the world's highest temperature, highest efficiency energy storage of any kind. And we commissioned this in March, and it is the proof point for commercial rollout. And again, this unit is capturing electricity during the periods where it would otherwise be curtailed or at very low price. This is a day a couple of years ago in California. There's wholesale power price, which not surprisingly collapses. This was all of the generation in SP15, and there's what the grid actually took. And this is not a battery. There are lots of folks who are working on the problem of harvesting power at noon and delivering it at 7 p.m. We're harvesting power with something that's actually much cheaper and lower cost per kilowatt to charge, and we're using it to turn off the gas combustion. Among pathways to turn off gas combustion, analysis by lots of folks is beginning to make it clear that this is lower cost and lower carbon emissions than any of the other proposed decarbonization pathways. So, you know, that's hundreds of millions of tons of direct emissions. And new research by Jesse Jenkins's group, and there are other folks working in this as well, is there's an additional handprint, the presence of what he calls demand sinks that are only buying the very least cost energy and are tied into the grid. They wind up lifting the floor prices. They wind up reducing start stops and inefficient operation of fossil generators. They wind up, in some cases, for every 1 megawatt of this kind of load, 1.9 megawatts of renewables got built because of what they did to the economics, and they never increased average electricity prices in any of the areas modeled. This is sort of new work. We're still, you know, there's modeling going on in other places. This looked at the US Northeast and Southeast. But we're pretty excited about the prospect as these units are rolling out. We actually build 3 different models that are sized for the needs of industry. The things that we're delivering right now are 100 and 300 megawatt hour roughly. I was just at COP last week talking about the first of our half dozen European projects. We are in construction in California, and this technology is now going to volume manufacturing. We have 2 gigawatt hours a year right now of production capacity with an Asian production partner, rising to 90 over the next few years. As it happens, our webinar this morning is quite well timed in that Treasury released guidance for the battery manufacturing production tax credit a few hours ago, earlier this morning, that says that incorporates thermal batteries. For scale, each one of these, that's a single brick. It stores 100 kilowatt hours, and like a Tesla Model X, it saves as much CO2 as about 3 Tesla Model X's because it's fully deeply discharged every single day. So that's, you know, I think that's a brief overview. And I think, you know, we see enormous opportunity to move very rapidly. There are plenty of challenges as well with things like grid access tariffs and the ability to participate in markets and interconnection rules that are very different, you know, different places in the US, different places in the world. We're focused on deploying right now in the places where it works, and very keen for an education process to take place to drive, you know, to open access kind of everywhere. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Very exciting to see all of those technologies in action, inspiring. All right, so before we turn to the panel discussion and questions where we're gonna talk about the barriers, I would like to invite our last speaker, Erica from Siemens. Erica will talk about Siemens financial models to help deploy large-scale clean energy projects, an important aspect of technology deployment. Please take away.
Thank you so much. So I would like to just start by saying I'm going to try to keep this brief. If we can just, I'll give you a little background on Siemens Financial Services, because a lot of people know Siemens. Siemens is very large. We've been around for 175 years, but Siemens Financial Services has only been around 25 years. And we're really born out of necessity to enable new and transitional technologies into the market. We got a lot of our start in funding wind farms and wind parks before they were broadly accepted as a safe financial investment by a lot of the traditional banks. And that's really where we still thrive today. We are enabling our Siemens technologies into the market, but also other partners and more advanced technologies into the market to really make this transition happen and make a difference. So we work across several different sectors: industrial transformation, smart infrastructure, intelligent mobility, healthcare, and really the energy transition. So we cover a lot of this, and you may or may not know that Siemens itself has been very aggressively pursuing decarbonization. We've already achieved 50% decarbonization since 2019. And our goal is to be net zero in operations by 2030. 90% of that we want to achieve with emissions reduction. So very, very bullish on ensuring that we decarbonize our own operations. And at the same time, we want to have the handprint, right? The ability to help our customers also go through this transition. And we really do this through financial services in many different ways. We can finance specific equipment, or we do some energy as a service type work. We will do project finance. So this is for the larger scale projects like those wind farms, solar farms, battery energy storage. And we also offer corporate lending. So this could be a loan in order to transition your own infrastructure to a decarbonized supply chain, or maybe you want to transition from a traditional model to a product as a service model in order to enable circularity and reduce waste. And that would go through our more traditional corporate lending. We also work very closely with the other Siemens business units, as well as other financial institutions where we will often partner in order to share the risk associated with a particular project or loan. And when we look at the ecosystem that's really necessary to enable this transition, it's far greater than what any one company, even a big company like Siemens, can address on its own. We need solutions that improve, the building envelope. We need solutions that provide industrial decarbonization solutions, thermal energy storage solutions like the one just presented. And these really need to be brought together in order to holistically address the problem. We know this from our own experience in decarbonizing our own industrial sites. It is not a simple solution. You have to look at it as an integrated system, and it's a systems of systems challenge. And then add that in the connection to the grid as well. It's just another layer on this. And it requires a lot of intelligence in order to truly achieve the goals, as well as significant financial investment. And while you can have a very clear ROI and some very good payback for many of these investments, there's still a significant upfront cost that's a barrier that needs to be addressed. And a lot of the tax credits we're seeing are making a big impact in that, but we'd love to see those go further. And the other thing that we found is very effective are programs like that of the loan programs guarantees, where they're actually sharing the risk on some of these more advanced technologies with other financial institutions in order to make all of our capital go further. In order to really get off the ground and move forward here, we've also started developing a tool. And this tool we call our DBO, Decarbonization Business Optimizer. And we're planning to launch it later this year as a free tool that anyone can request access to and help them look at how they might be able to decarbonize their site, and then help get them from there to the products and solutions, whether they're Siemens or a Siemens partner, in order to make it happen. And the way the DBO works is it's first going to baseline the current carbon footprint of the site based on estimates. They come from leveraging large data sets that have been put together by the US Department of Energy, such as the Comstock database that NREL manages and the Industrial Assessment Center's database, in addition to some of our own data, in order to really get a good estimate based on a location and a building type and size, or industrial park size, what their carbon footprint and energy use likely is, and what their load profile likely is. We're also enabling them to update it and upload their own energy profile if they have it. But what we found is that a lot of our customers, particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises, don't have easy access to that. And it's so challenging for them to go in and dig it up. They're not really willing to make that investment of their time or to contract an energy engineer to work on this for $15,000 or $30,000 until they have some level of confidence that there's a possibility of a positive ROI. So we wanted to make something where it's a playground, it's a place to get them engaged and help them get started. And the other reason for this is we as Siemens, we don't just have commitment to decarbonize our own operations, we have commitments to decarbonize our supply chain. And we're asking our suppliers to decarbonize. That means we need to help them. We need to help them do that. We need to help them get on the path. Otherwise, particularly the small ones will be left behind. So really being able to give them these tools to get started is extremely important. But in the next step, creating those scenarios and helping them look at the targets and say, all right, if you invest $4 million, this is the level of decarbonization you can achieve, and here's the payback. Or if your target is a 30% decarbonization, what is an estimated cost to achieve that? And again, we're using all publicly available and trusted data sources. So for all of the technology costs, we're using the annual technology baseline from NREL. So it's not Siemens specific, it's vendor agnostic. It does include options like thermal energy storage, hot and cold, in addition to battery energy storage. We're looking at wind, solar, electrification, and really trying to say, okay, what is the pathway that could get you there and how can we help? And we really found that that initial knowledge barrier, as well as financing availability for some of these more complex projects or more, let's say, innovative technologies that we want to bring in, tend to be the two largest roadblocks that we just want to be able to push past in order to really make a difference in this transition. So with that, I will return back to our host to kick off Q&A.
All right, thank you for Erica. I would like to invite all our panelists back to join a quick round of discussion. You have seen a lay of the land and different perspectives. Since Erica, you are the last speaker, actually I will start with you. And since people still have a fresh memory of the model you just presented, you mentioned the financeability. What are the common traits that you are seeing or have seen or you're looking for in some of the successful projects that Siemens is financing?
I would say some of the successful kind of traits in those projects are really have to do with the incentives that are available, absolutely, for the technology adoption. but also the ability to participate in those grid markets and have additional revenue streams based on them. That makes a big difference in the financial viability of these technologies. So, for example, the rollout of FERC Order 2222, as we're seeing that expand, our battery storage technologies aren't just in Texas anymore, right? We're really seeing an expansion of interest in some of these projects that provide additional services.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned being able to participate in the grid service. I think, John, in your presentation, you also alluded to that's one of the challenges. Would you like to add some thoughts, really the most significant barriers to implementing thermal storage from your experience?
Sure. But I would say that this matter of participating in the grid is actually it's an upside opportunity. We have some projects right now with somebody called it the cat's ears, where the developer is going to sell power to the grid during the higher price periods, and then sell power into a heat battery during the low price periods. And so that grid participation can be valuable. However, FERC orders for batteries and battery participation, there are lots of questions about, is that a battery? Is that, is it with or without? Here in California, there's a real drive for decarbonization, but as it happens, California charges a volumetric transmission cost that is independent of cost causation, whether you're taking power on or off peak. And that transmission access charge is more than the cost of fuel, so that even if electricity were free, there's no way that these things can come into the grid. There are other examples, mid-continent. There were 2,000 hours of negative electricity prices last year in Oklahoma, and loads like this, switchable, telemetry connected, price responsive loads, could completely change the economic picture for nuclear plant operators in that region. But, access, participation, SPP is today severely restricted. So but on the other hand, in ERCOT, those barriers don't exist. So it's a very regional by regional thing. The things that we're working on in Europe, again, the rules are different in Denmark and Ireland, and then Scandinavia, the Norway and Germany for that matter. And so it's a longer thing that we have to talk about right now, but enabling large loads that are fundamentally never going to take a single megawatt hour from a thermal power plant. If you're replacing natural gas, electricity made from natural gas is always at least twice as expensive as the gas. So these are loads that will not be operating during grid peaks, that economically will not be driving new other costs in the grid, finding our way to regulatory frameworks so that they can interconnect in a way that's reflective of the costs they present to the grid, can create all these benefits.
Yeah, thank you. To follow up on that question, the comment you made, the regulatory change, we needed data, we need analysis to support decision making, right? That's important. I'm going to turn to Hayden to ask about, how do you see DOE and the national labs analysis can inform this decision making? As Erica mentioned, it's a challenge, it's a system of system. It's not just like a one single analysis solution can provide an answer. Markets vary across the nation. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so both PNNL and other national labs have been doing a lot of work sort of analyzing future states, right? And we have the sort of unique capability to look cross-sectorially and really look at the full stack of the grid to understand this. And I think that's been very useful to understand the value proposition and the large-scale feasibility. And now I think more and more we're turning our attention then to sort of the pathways and the support both to implementers and then to decision makers of like, how do we then go through the steps? What are the evolutionary steps look like? How do you start off? At what point do you then need to switch from, let's say, time of use to a dynamic rate or to a fully transactive rate? So that's a lot of our attention now. I think we'll see a lot of variation in the approach, and currently a lot of it's just driven by climate and load stresses. So I think we'll see more of that as well.
All right, thank you. What's your thought, Andrew, as a policy or research analyst at NGO? What do you see, NGO like ICT others' role in bridging this knowledge gap?
Yeah, thanks, Nora. I think that the role of NGOs is primarily as thought leaders or identifying opportunities that are outside standard practice that can move the market and advance methodologies like handprint. Analyses like the ones that ICT has done that I talked about to help frame the benefits of technology in terms that are responsive to issues that motivate stakeholders. So we can build out models and proofs of concept. We can analyze and attribute savings, but it's up to policymakers to standardize calculation and or attribution methodologies and technology companies who are the ones setting ESG targets to collect data on the use of their products, which is really critical. So it's essential, in my view, that the NGO community communicates that need to policymakers and to the technologies that we companies that we engage with. And I see a key role for NGO input in that conversation as to how best to approach attribution and standardization of emissions calculation protocol.
Yeah, thank you. Totally agreed. I'm going to turn to Fran. Definitely that's one aspect of policy analysis. Is that enough, right? Dell is much bigger than Rondo Energy. You can scale up very fast. You presented a very nice technology that you have to stabilize the grid and provide efficiency. But why we're not there yet, even with large company like Dell and Intel in the Army, but we're still far from getting the grid modernization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to kind of follow up on what all the other panelists talked about too, I think it might sound like an all of the above sort of answer, but I think that it needs to be a combination of policy, regulation, and that IT-OT convergence in order to transform grid operations as they exist today. I think when people think about, envision a grid of the future, that looks different to anyone you ask, but we do find commonalities and shared goals, ESG goals, like Andrew said, set by companies or regulatory goals or expected demand that we need to meet. And in order to transition from a grid that's largely unidirectional and centralized to something that is more distributed and can incorporate more distributed resources and also just more demand, it takes a collaborative effort. And I think Andrew's absolutely right. It's important to have people that are able to liaise between policymakers and innovators as they come up with these ideas, because even as we see with new rounds of federal funding, which is fantastic for grid resilience programs, a lot of the proposals that people have made previously have been repairing existing technology in order to kind of keep the grid up and running to support this new load. But people are also coming up with new innovative ideas every single day. And so we need to find ways to not only support repairs, but also innovation at the edge. And, specifically at a substation level, if you're asking about grid operations, I think interoperability is really important. Most electromechanical substations as they exist are comprised of largely distributed single function devices. And that makes it hard to update and make changes. And so as we begin to virtualize, like we talked about with our specific substation virtualization solution, it gets easier to update software and accommodate new and larger workloads as demand continues to grow.
Thank you. Absolutely. You reinforce Erica's message that it's a big company, a big challenge beyond one company can handle, no matter how big you are. All right. I wish we had more time to have that conversation. I think another hour, probably easily to fill up a lot of a good discussion. I'm going to wrap up, but before that, I actually want to go back to each panelist to ask you to summarize, if you were to distill your message to our audience today and into a piece of advice or call to action, what that 1 or 2 sentences might be. We can start with the order of the presentation. If you still remember, we'll start with Hayden.
Yeah, to emphasize John's point, I think moving towards cost reflective incentives and rates to drive these solutions economically, it would be my number one ask.
Thank you. Andrew?
I would say scope 3 emissions, supply chain emissions are complicated already. Add in the use of technology of ICT, and that complexity is only exacerbated. The market needs a way to reliably determine the emissions impact of technology products downstream of deployment and to attribute those impacts to distinct players.
That's a great summary. Fran?
Yeah, I would just say collaboration is incredibly important. We need to partner innovation with regulation and incentivize innovation at all tiers within the grid modernization initiatives.
Thank you. John?
I would echo some of what you all just said. I was on a panel with the head of sustainability at one of the consumer brands at Climate Week, who said the factory team always hates it when the decarbonization team shows up. And other people have said, the chief sustainability officer and this chief financial officer are at loggerheads. We are at a tipping point where that is no longer true, right? I mean, what we're doing and what others are doing, there are these drop-in technologies tied into telemetry and intelligent technologies that will harness what's going on with the grid. We are at a tipping point where what's going on with the grid that people think are problems are creating this great opportunity, and particularly that the industrial sector can move rapidly to decarbonize, and in doing that can increase the resiliency and the stability of the grid and lower costs for other participants as well.
Well said. Last but not least, Erica.
I would just reiterate what I heard others say too about collaboration, like really, really focusing on working together to address the problem holistically, because it isn't one solution that's going to get us where we need to go. And of course, too, if you are working on a project or a decarbonization project and looking for financing, happy to have that conversation as well.
It's a good way to wrap up our call. All right, so as we wrap up our scheduled time, our 3 minutes over, I would like to extend sincere gratitude to all our speakers for generously sharing your knowledge and experience. And special thanks go to Nick Roper and Archie Fresser at ACEEE team. You don't see them, but they're supporting, the smooth operation behind the scenes. I appreciate everyone in attendance today. I hope you've gained valuable insights, and should you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us or the panelists. We wish you all wonderful holidays ahead, and thank you for attending today's webinar.